So it gives me great pleasure, of course, to welcome as our guest speaker this evening, Craig Monahan. You may have read in the flyer that went out in the last Three-Headed Dog that Craig is an accomplished screenwriter, director and producer whose list of credits includes award-winning films The Interview, Peaches and Healing, all of which starred Hugo Weaving. He also has, and this is the key point, an abiding interest in naval history, historical events and stories. In 2022, he produced an excellent 9-part podcast that provides a compelling account of the sinking of HMAS Armidale by Japanese aircraft in 1942 and the subsequent heroism of the survivors off Australia's northwest coast. Only 49 of the 149 men on board survived the attack and subsequent ordeal on a raft and in the lifeboats. The podcast includes eyewitness accounts from some of those present, and as I've highlighted previously, is available on the Naval Historical Society website. Of course, that's conveyed by sound alone. So I'll leave him to tell you of his aspirations to bring this story to a wider audience through a feature film documentary. So please give a warm welcome to Craig Monahan.
Okay, well, I'm right out of my comfort zone. It's a great pleasure to be here. I've never served, so I get that part in a room like this, that makes me feel a little bit guilty, but it just wasn't my pathway. The Armidale is something that I came across about 20-25 years ago, and it was something that just stuck with me, really. And Teddy Sheehan, most people would know of Teddy, and slowly but surely over time, it just kept getting under my skin. I'd read something, I'd find something out, or something else would happen, or I'd talk to somebody. And slowly but surely I realised there was an incredibly larger story than just Teddy. Teddy's story itself's pretty bloody large.
So I'd like to introduce you to the Armidale Project. This is the search for the tomb and final resting place of the crew of HMAS Armidale, as well as a 100-minute documentary film about that search and the incredible true story that is Armidale. Just quickly, some background. His Majesty's Australian ship Armidale was an Australian corvette sunk by the Japanese in a 3-minute hellfire off the coast of East Timor on December the 1st, 1942. Over 50 lives were lost and over 100 men went into the water. Armidale is the extraordinary true story of Lieutenant Commander David Richards and his brave young crew, average age 21, including Edward Teddy Sheehan VC, who battled disaster and extreme conditions on the open sea, bound together by comradeship, duty and their instinct for survival. Sheehan was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross of Australia some 78 years after the event, and leading seaman Lee Bull wrote, "Sheehan had no chance of escape. Strapped to his anti-aircraft gun, he blazed away till the last." Now, within the Australian Navy, Armidale is legendary. A class of patrol boats has been designated Armidale class, and a Collins-class submarine has been named HMAS Sheehan in honour of Ordinary Seaman Edward Teddy Sheehan VC, who, despite being seriously wounded by gunfire, strapped himself to an Oerlikon 20mm gun and continued firing at the enemy as the ship sank. It is the only ship ever named after an ordinary seaman. So to start, I'd like you to watch this 4-minute teaser we've made. Thank you.
And I stopped and I turned around and I tread water and I watched the ship sink. And it was going down very quickly, and then when it was almost disappeared, almost as if it paused and stopped for a second, as if it were reluctant to disappear. Then it did, and having paused, it just slid under, and that was probably, apart from the deaths of my parents, the saddest moment of my life.
This is the remarkable true story of HMAS Armidale and its extraordinary crew. The Armidale story remained classified for almost 50 years.
At the height of the Second World War, the Australian corvette has sailed out from Darwin on a secret mission to East Timor. Out of the clear blue sky, a Japanese spotter plane appears, then 9 bombers and 3 Zero fighters. Armidale's captain, Lieutenant Commander David Richards, sounds the alarm.
The Japanese attack is relentless.
Richards has no choice but to give the order. Ordinary seaman Edward Teddy Sheehan, a gunloader just 18 years old, looks at his shipmates in the water and sees they are being slaughtered. He wheels his gun from target to target and keeps firing until he and Armidale are gone.
He gave his life to save the lives of his shipmates.
For his actions, Teddy Sheehan has been posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross of Australia. He is the first member of the Royal Australian Navy to receive the distinction.
When that hit, I turned round to have a look, see what was going on, and the stern come out of the water like that, and the 2 propellers are just going round and round up in the air like that.
And I just looked around and I could see the heads here and there, and some dead mates and some wounded.
Fighting for their lives in the water are around 100 men.
Sharks and things were sort of hanging around, and although you weren't completely out of the water, it made you feel a little bit safer because you didn't know just when you were going to be pruned off round about the knees, you know.
A photograph is taken of the men on the raft. They are waving up at the Catalina, so close to being rescued.
The thought still comes to me at times when I wander around. Did the blokes on the raft think I walked out of them? And it's a very hard question. To get an answer to that, you've got to have them. Had I been left on the raft, I think I'd have been fairly unhappy. Although going in the whaler, there was no certainty you were going to be picked up. There was no certainty that anybody was going to be picked up.
Okay, finding the tomb and final resting place of the crew of HMAS Armidale. The search for Armidale is a key element to telling the whole Armidale story. It is important to commemorate the men lost and to bring a measure of peace to their families and loved ones. It offers a finality to what is an incredibly rich and layered story, and as I've said, of which Teddy Sheehan, VC, and his extraordinary bravery is but one part. As you will come to see, the Armidale story is spread over some 80 plus years. On board Armidale were 149 men, of whom 100 were killed in action, drowned, died of wounds, or listed as missing in action and presumed dead. These men were predominantly Australian. However, there were men from Indonesia, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, and Timor-Leste. Finding the Armidale wreck is extremely important, as it would then be protected as an underwater cultural heritage. There are international conventions covering wrecks, but Armidale, like Perth, is not in Australian waters, so Australia has a limited control, as seen in the destruction for profit of Perth by salvage hunters on the seabed in Indonesian waters. Now, the Armidale search area has been defined by correlating the captain's last recorded position and from Japanese air naval records. HMAS Armidale currently lies in an area some 60 nautical miles south of Timor-Leste and is at a depth of up to 2,000 metres. This is a map of the Armidale's journey and where it went down and where the whaler, the raft and the motorboat were picked up, their positions. The search requires liaising primarily with the Australian and Timor-Leste governments. The governments of the Netherlands, Indonesia and the UK will also be informed of the planned search. This is necessary not only for the search but also as the wreck site will be the final resting place of their war dead. This all takes time and we have a very good team. This includes Mr Angus Callender, whose father, Lance Corporal John Callender, AIF, was on board Armidale. And Angus is from the Remembering Armidale Society. Mr Ted Graham, AM, former chair of the Finding Sydney Foundation, and Mr John Perryman, CSM, former Director Naval History at the Sea Power Centre. Now, Ted Graham is the Western Australian Honorary Consul for Timor-Leste. And also on board, of course, is myself, and together we hope to tell the Armidale story and find the resting place of the ship and its very brave young crew. Ted and Angus are working with Ocean Infinity, an international marine robotic technology company that recently established an Australian base in Hobart. One of Ocean Infinity's most recent discoveries was Sir Ernest Shackleton's ship Endurance. The ship was found in the Antarctic in 2022, 107 years after it sank. There's a great drama in finding Armidale. Will it be found? Where exactly is it? What condition is it in? Is Teddy Sheehan's Oerlikon gun intact? This search will be interwoven into the narrative of the Armidale story. Why is this important? Well, for us there's a very strong element of this all being self-evident. However, it's important that Australians are exposed to their own history, and the story of Armidale is one that deserves to be told. Rather than it being a limited news item when the ship is found, we will be producing a film about the search and the story of Armidale and its very brave young crew, a story that was classified for 50 years, and one that will appeal to Australians of all ages. So, the documentary treatment. Who is telling the story? Well, Armidale will be a dramatic telling of the events using a mix of on-camera interviews, archival stills and footage. The story of Armidale is based on facts uncovered by searches of Navy records, transcripts of official inquiries, documented evidence and recorded on-camera interviews with Ray Leonard and Rex Pullen, both great characters and storytellers. They are the key link as the story unfolds. In addition, many survivors wrote about their experiences, including Ordinary Seaman Cole Madigan, Russ Carrow and Bill Reid, Gunnery Officer Lloyd Palmer, Leading Seaman Lee Bull, Signalman Arthur Lansbury and Able Seaman Bill McKellar. Laced into our narrative, we will see and live the search for the tomb and final resting place of the crew of HMAS Armidale, narrated by John Perryman, CSM. We will also be interviewing Teddy Sheehan's cousin, Gary Ivory, who drove what was a contentious campaign for Teddy's VC. So, based in Darwin, Armidale, under the command of Lieutenant Commander David Richards, was sent on a top-secret mission to East Timor to deliver over 60 Dutch NEI, Javanese, fighters at Botano Bay, Timor. Also on the mission were HMAS Castlemaine and HMAS Kuru, but tragically the mission did not go to plan. Having been spotted by the Japanese, Armidale was forced to hide in rain squalls to evade an attack and consequently missed the arranged rendezvous. When Armidale's position became known by the enemy, Richards requested permission to return to Darwin. In a remarkable and fateful decision, Darwin-based Naval Command, Commodore Cuthbert Pope, ordered Richards to complete the mission the following night. Ordinary Seaman Rex Pullen has written, "At that time I think it would be pretty general to say that we were well aware of the fact that it would only be an act of God if we got out of this scrape that we were in." During the onslaught, instead of abandoning ship as ordered, 18-year-old Teddy Sheehan turned back to his anti-aircraft gun to defend his shipmates against the Japanese aircraft strafing them in the water. Though severely wounded, Sheehan shot down one enemy aircraft and damaged two others. He went down with the ship, his gun still firing. This is a quote from Sir Guy Green. "This was not an empty heroic gesture which achieved nothing. His action ensured that there was just enough time before the ship sank for many of those on board to abandon ship, for rafts and floats to be launched, and for the depth charges which might otherwise have killed the survivors to be disarmed. That time, which undoubtedly saved many lives, was purchased at the cost of Teddy Sheehan's own life." Sheehan's selfless heroism was extraordinary, but his actions are but one part of the fascinating and multi-layered Armidale story. Over 50 men perished in the initial sinking. The remaining survivors clung to whatever they could find and fought for over a week against hunger, thirst, blistering heat, sea snakes and sharks as they awaited a rescue that for many never came. Their days were spent in despair, their nights in horror, as they witnessed the sharks devouring the bodies of comrades who had succumbed to their wounds. Stoker Ray Raymond. Joe Curry floated near us for days. Sometimes the sharks would nudge him from underneath and take a bite out of him, but he stuck around just the same. I knew it was Joe because of the ring on his finger. When we found we had to go back into Patano, Joe said to me, "If anything happens to me, send this ring back to my mother." I told him I would. The survivors split into 3 groups: the raft, the whaler and the motorboat. Now, telling this part of the Armidale story will involve volunteers, and I think this is far better than any potential reenactment, which tend to be unengaging for an audience. So putting them on a raft, a whaler and a motorboat for a day or two, engaging with them regarding the experience of being lost at sea, should be pretty good, we think. You know, what do they think? What do they feel? What are they going to do about it? Lieutenant Commander David Richards, the only one left who could navigate, filled the one leaking motorboat still afloat with wounded and made for a known reconnaissance area. That's a photo of 19-year-old Ordinary Seaman Fred Smith, and this is a quote from Ted Morley. On the thwart opposite me was a Javanese bloke with his entrails hanging out of his stomach. Beside him was Ordinary Seaman Fred Smith. His nose was gone and he had bullets in his stomach and his entrails were hanging out too. So my only view was these 2 sets of entrails. Smith died that night, but the native bloke lived another couple of days, so I still had entrails to look at, but I wasn't much to look at myself with my jaw shot away. Days passed, with no sign of rescue. Those who remained with the raft at the original site of Armidale's sinking managed, in a superhuman effort, to refloat a half-submerged, severely damaged whaler in the hope of rowing it to Darwin. With limited space, only 29 could embark on the perilous voyage, leaving the remaining 40 clinging to the precariously constructed raft. After a gruelling period on the open sea, the motorboat 5 days and the whaler 8 days, rescue came. This is a quote from Fred Still. They were a pitiful sight. Their condition was appalling, with sunburnt, blistered, ulcerated skin covered in caked fuel oil and salt. They were wrinkled up like prunes. Their rib cages stuck out, some were bleeding from the backside, and their eyes were glazed. This is a photograph of the men on the raft that was taken about 6 days after the sinking. There should be probably about 40 people there, but I can't count 40. It probably is the most poignant photograph around the whole Armidale story. This is a quote from Ordinary Seaman Russ Carrow. One of the blokes on the raft, stoker Jim McVicker, had been married for less than 1 day. He was married in Sydney on Saturday afternoon, and we sailed early next morning. They never saw each other again. Commodore Pope, NOIC Darwin, ordered an inquiry into the sinking, specifically the conduct of the ship's crew while under attack. Armidale's mission was never mentioned. Richard, still recovering and caring for his men, whilst desperate to learn the fate of those still lost at sea on the raft, gives evidence at the inquiry into the loss of Armidale. The inquiry findings were classified for over 50 years, and, as a result, the crew of Armidale received no recognition for their incredible bravery. It would be 40 years before the fate of HMAS Armidale and its fearless crew finally received recognition, and in 2020, Edward Teddy Sheehan was awarded the Victoria Cross of Australia. Of course, there's a lot more detail with all of this, but finding the wreck of the Armidale is one strain and making a documentary film about it and telling the Armidale story is another, and they go hand in hand and will complement each other. As a filmmaker now, I move into another world, which is anybody going to want to see it, and how do we get people to see it? Finding the tomb and final resting place of the crew of Armidale and telling the Armidale story will build on the fascination with Australian history, especially our war history. This has always been strong. Examples include Gallipoli and Breaker-Morant and the documentary The Battle of Long Tan. As there are very few documentaries about the exploits and events that faced this country at a time of war, in particular naval stories, we feel there is a significant and ready-made audience for Armidale. By including young volunteers when telling the story of the raft, the whaler and the motorboat, the film offers the ability to engage a wide audience that potentially goes beyond those just interested in history. It is about a younger audience feeling and understanding the weight of it. We believe the story will engage a wide audience, not only at home but also in countries that had similar experiences during wartime. The impact the film may have. History must always be part of the conversation. The importance of finding the tomb and final resting place of the crew of HMAS Armidale. Armidale is a story that was not allowed to be told for 50 years. Increased awareness of time, place and events. Underscores a level of conflict that needs to be understood. How our past impacts our present. Unresolved traumas of those who lost loved ones. Honour the people who lived through it. Education tool in schools. Armidale will be popular with males and females interested in this period and in history generally, lest we forget. Daily, social media generates an enormous amount of information on people and there is little time left for history or reflection. It is important to remember and honour those who gave their lives. There is a weight to it. Every family was impacted. It is also about not being blindsided by what can happen and what is happening in the world today. Okay, well this brings us really to the status of the project. Where are we at the present time? The project has been accepted by the Documentary Australia Foundation, enabling any investor to receive a 100% tax deduction. We've secured a domestic distributor with a view to the film being released in cinemas on or around Anzac Day or Remembrance Day. This is significant and really shouldn't be taken lightly as very few documentaries get a cinema release. While we're all working together on the Armidale project, any donations or investment through Documentary Australia are for the documentary only and are not part of financing the search for Armidale. We have previously employed recognised researcher Naomi Hall from Research Engine and would like to be able to continue to work with her. All the footage you've seen so far, she was the one who found it. She's found about 70 films so far, but there's certainly a lot more work to be done. We're securing the use of HMAS Castlemaine, which is currently docked in Williamstown. The idea is to be on a real corvette. We hope this will all be forthcoming. We'd like to have it towed out to Port Phillip Bay and film it with drones from different angles, put that footage into the computer and place it on the Timor Sea. It becomes a very good visual link and bridge as we tell the story. This is a terrific quote and a poignant quote from able seaman Roy Cleland. Every year on the day Armidale was sunk, I take the day off. I go to Young and Jackson's hotel and buy 2 glasses of beer. I drink my own and leave the other one. Sometimes when I'm leaving, the barmaid will ask me about the other glass, and I tell her. My mates will be along to take care of that. Okay, well that's a bit of a précis, obviously, of what's going on with regard finding the wreck of Armidale and the documentary. There's the podcast. I hope everybody might get the chance to listen to that at some point. Earlier you saw a teaser, and now I would like to show you a trailer that we've made. In the fullness of time, I hope to make a feature-length film like Dunkirk, 1917, Gallipoli, Breaker-Morant, about Armidale. And what I'm about to show you now, whilst it has some element of repetition, it is a trailer for the project, and as it progresses, we bring in illustrations or storyboards, and you'll start to see the possibilities with regards to a feature film.
And I stopped, and I turned around, and I tread water, and I watched the ship sink. And it was going down very quickly, and then when it was almost disappeared, almost as if it paused and stopped for a second, as if it were reluctant to disappear. Then it did, and having paused, it just slid under, and that was probably, apart from the deaths of my parents, the saddest moment of my life.
This is the remarkable true story of HMAS Armidale and its extraordinary crew. The Armidale story remained classified for almost 50 years.
At the height of the Second World War, the Australian corvette has sailed out from Darwin on a secret mission to East Timor. Out of the clear blue sky, a Japanese spotter plane appears, 9 bombers and 3 Zero fighters. The Zeros rake the decks with machine gun fire, bombs are dropped, Armidale's gunners respond. Then an aerial torpedo slams into the ship. Ordinary seaman Edward Teddy Sheehan, a gunloader just 18 years old, looks at his shipmates in the water and sees they are being slaughtered. He wheels his gun from target to target and keeps firing until he and Armidale are gone. He gave his life to save the lives of his shipmates. For his actions, Teddy Sheehan has been posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross of Australia. He is the first member of the Royal Australian Navy to receive the distinction.
Armidale was crewed by regular and voluntary seamen. Their average age was just 21.
The 2 people central to Armidale's fateful mission were the ship's captain, Lieutenant Commander David Richards, and Commodore Cuthbert Pope, the naval officer in charge of Darwin. In 1942 in Darwin, Pope and Richards found themselves in the front line of Australia's wartime defence, with the Japanese advancing.
On Timor, they rapidly build up their troop numbers by the thousands. The small contingent of Australian troops are overrun. Australia's military chiefs plan a mission to relieve the Australian troops. And there's another key objective: to transport to Timor a contingent of Netherlands East Indies soldiers. To carry out this top-secret mission, Commodore Pope decides to send a convoy led by the corvette HMAS Castlemaine. It would be accompanied by the patrol boat HMAS Kuru and the ill-fated Armidale. Their destination is Botano Bay.
The convoy is spotted by a Japanese reconnaissance plane.
Lieutenant Commander Sullivan on Castlemaine sends a signal to Darwin.
Consider prospect operation doubtful. Request orders.
In an extraordinary and fateful decision, Pope orders the ships to complete the mission.
It seemed to us utterly stupid and ridiculous. It was inevitable that the closer we got back to Timor, to Botano, the closer we were getting to the airport and the quicker their turnaround was. I mean, you just couldn't live under those circumstances.
The Japanese attack is relentless.
Richards has no choice but to give the order.
Abandon ship! Abandon ship!
I turned round to have a look, see what was going on, and the stern come out of the water like that, and the 2 propellers are just going round and round up in the air like that.
I just looked around and I could see the heads here and there, and some dead mates and some wounded.
Of the 149 men on board Armidale, only 49 survived the ordeal. Apart from bobbing heads, the only objects visible above the surface are the motorboat, badly damaged by machine gun fire, along with 1 Carley float, 3 Denton rafts, and 2 minesweeping floats.
Fighting for their lives in the water are around 100 men.
Back where we'd been sunk, all this flotsam was going around, and those who could swam off, grabbed hold of a plank and swam back with it and put it all into one centre. The ones who were knocked about and wounded and one thing and another and couldn't do very much work, they stayed there with the ropes and things and untwisted the ropes to make them go further, tied as many of these planks together, and we made a big raft.
While at it, they discover the whaler.
But peppered by machine gun shells and with a gaping hole in one side, it now sits about a metre below the surface.
Sharks and things were sort of hanging around, and although you weren't completely out of the water, it made you feel a little bit safer because you didn't know just when you're going to be pruned off round about the knees, you know.
The most seriously wounded have been put in the patched-up motorboat.
They were lying at the bottom of the motorboat, which was next to us, and they had some shocking injuries, the people in that motorboat that night, and they suffered a great deal, which added to our suffering.
Richards is well aware the wounded need help. If nothing is done, some or all will die.
He put it to everybody what he proposed to do, to leave and go off on the motorboat. He obviously felt a little uneasy about this, leaving the ship as it were, but it was the right thing to do. He was the only really qualified navigator, so he had to go.
Lieutenant Lloyd Palmer is put in command of the remaining survivors.
Commodore Pope now holds grave fears for Armidale. On the motorboat, their skin is peeling and blistering, lips are cracked, hair and beards matted in furnace oil. The condition of those with injuries is deteriorating.
For the men on the raft and floats, it has been another rough night. When a head count is taken at sunrise, more of the men are missing, having succumbed to the cold or taken by sharks.
We'd had a parley back in the raft, and it was decided that we should try and float the whaler.
Men in the water pushed and dragged the boat stern first and inch by inch edged a few feet of the keel onto the sunken raft.
In circumstances such as we ran into, lifting that whaler out of the water was brilliant. It was absolutely brilliant. There's no other way of describing it. And when I look back and think about it, and think how hopeless everything was, to think that I finally finished up here talking with you fellas today, that's a great achievement.
An RAAF Hudson approaches and flies low over the motorboat. On receiving a signal from the Hudson, Commodore Pope immediately orders the corvette HMAS Kalgoorlie to the area.
Back at the scene of the sinking, Palmer decides that the logical course of action is to leave in the whaler with some of the men and try to get help.
He had to select some of the lightly injured from that amongst us, and then select a group of people whom he thought he could rely on to row.
Lloyd Palmer puts Sub-Lieutenant Jim Buckland in charge of the 46 men who will remain on the raft and the Carley float. Buckland is just 22 years old.
Then around 10 p.m, Richards and the men watch with relief as Kalgoorlie approaches out of the darkness and scrambling nets are dropped. But, too weak to stand, they collapse.
On the whaler, the men continue to row for their lives. Around 9 a.m, their effort is rewarded with a noticeable change in the weather.
It was absolutely marvellous. Water, just plain bloody water. It's great.
While the change in weather brings some joy to the men on the whaler, it will prove to have tragic consequences for Sub-Lieutenant Jim Buckland and the other remaining survivors.
A photograph is taken of the men on the raft. They are waving up at the Catalina, so close to being rescued. This photo has become the most poignant reminder of this whole ill-fated mission.
The thought still comes to me at times when I wander around. Did the blokes on the raft think I walked out on them? And it's a very hard question. To get an answer to that, you've got to have them. Had I been left on the raft, I think I'd have been fairly unhappy. Although going in the whaler, there was no certainty you were going to be picked up. There was no certainty that anybody was going to be picked up.
I always thought we'd be saved, but I know others didn't, and they become more despondent in the conviction that what's happening to us.
The moment the men on the whaler have been waiting for finally arrives.
What I saw of these 28 other fellas what they put up with, what they did, their determination, their grit, and the mere fact that they weren't going to be beaten. I mean, that's good stuff.
The crew who survived the sinking of Armidale have returned to their homes and bases. They do their best to ignore the emotional pain. Some of the Armidale sailors were hit harder than others, but none escaped entirely. Some died young.
As Australia emerged from the horrors of World War II, the Armidale story remained classified for almost 50 years. Through that time, the public remained largely unaware of the heroism of Teddy Sheehan and other crew members, of the men who lost their lives, the ordeal after the ship went down, or the endurance, ingenuity and determination of the survivors.
On the 12th of August 2020, the Governor-General, David Hurley, announces that the Queen has approved the posthumous awarding of the Victoria Cross for Australia to Edward Teddy Sheehan. The announcement marks the end of a long and contentious campaign to recognise the 18-year-old ordinary seaman from Tasmania. But it also serves as a reminder of the sacrifice made by the other young sailors who lost their lives alongside Teddy Sheehan.
When announcing the awarding of the Victoria Cross for Australia to ordinary seaman Teddy Sheehan, the Governor-General said,
"The story is inspiring, and it should inspire us all."
Herein lies the crux of the Armidale story. It is about who we are and the best we can be.
Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed that. Special thanks. There's any number of people to thank, and to date we have tremendous support, and the names of those people involved are there for anyone to see. They're supporting the project, and what's terrific about this, of course, is that we have momentum, and that's really important for something like this.
It's very much a passion project for me, but it is also a necessary project, I think. It just covers so many bases that it's quite extraordinary. So it's a good team. It's a good team, and we just got to make it work.
And on that note, noting that you do like the red wine.
Thank you.
Many thanks.
Thank you.